Okay, so now it's being shared and we're being recorded, so we're good to go. Mike Rubin was going to join, but I guess he didn't join yet. Okay, so let's start from the Gemara on Mem Chasim Beis. Let me just change the daf on the screen.
I think we're up to Ashkelon.
Yes, that's what Shimon said this morning. So it's like 8 lines up in the skinny lines. Oh no, you're further down. Where are you up to?
I think he said Ashkelon.
So Ashkelon Shchita v'Kabbalah la'akev b'nolam?
Ashkelon Shchita ba'oila l'mitzvah Kabbalah nami.
So Ashkelon Shchita ba'oila, we have a concept that by oila the Shchita has to be b'tzafon, l'mitzvah, and Kabbalah nami l'mitzvah Ashkelon. And Kabbalah also, we have one mention of the fact that the Kabbalah has to be mitzvah, so we know mitzvah. But we also know that in order for something to be ma'akiv by kachim, it has to be mentioned twice. So shchita v'kabbalah la'akiv minolam, how do you know by oilas la'akiv? Now by chatas we know it's la'akiv because of all those times it says yishachat chatas v'koyim ha'shachat ha'oila. But by oila we don't have a double lashon. So how do we know by oila? So Amar of Adar bar Abba v'itema Rabba bar Shiva. It's a kal v'chomer. Ma de chatos haba mikach oila. Chatos is shmacher than oila. V'horai, it only gets its koyach from oila. Nevertheless, makeves sofan is ma'akev side by the shchita, side by the kabbalah. Oila shaba chatos mikoycha. Oila, which is stronger than chatos, because that's where the whole koyach of chatos comes from. Einoi din sham ma'akeves. Surely it should be ma'akev. Zog to Gemara, that's not a good kal v'chomer, because malachatos shekein mechaperes al chayve krisos. Chatos has a chumrot mechaper al chayve krisos. That's why it needs tzafon. But mahechatesi that oila would need tzafon. Amar Avina hakash yleiler avada barava. It wasn't really a kal v'chomer. It was a very good logical argument. Klum matzani hafal chomer menekir. Will you ever find that the derivative should have a greater chomer than the source? It doesn't make sense to say that the chatos, which only is derived from oila, is going to be ma'akev b'di'evet tzafon, but by oila, which is the source, it's not ma'akev. It's just not palatable. Such a shmor. Amalei marzuta b'reida of Mori Lavina. Why is it not palatable? I'm going to give you 3 different examples where the source is more kuladik than the derivative. The derivative is going to be more chomer than the source. And we'll start with number 1. V'loi. Now we could turn on to daf mem tes amid aleph. V'arei meiser. Now the halacha is, if you have meiser sheni in Yerushalayim, you're not allowed to be paided. You have to eat it. But there's one exception. If it became tamei, you could be paided. What if I had meiser sheni in chutz Yerushalayim and it was already paided? I brought money with me to Yerushalayim. In Yerushalayim, I bought pears, and those pears became tamei. Can I be paided those pears? And the answer to that is no. So the meiser itself, you could be paided when it's tamei. But the derivative of meiser, this that came from the meiser, is more chomer, and you can't be paided if it's tamei. V'arei meiser dehu nifta. Meiser itself, you could be paid when it's tamei in Yerushalayim. V'il lakuach because of meiser, but something you purchased because of meiser, which is only a derivative of meiser, any nifta. And where do we know this from? This is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. It's not halakuach because of meiser shenitba yifta, but Rabbi Yehuda imer yikaver. So you see from Rabbi Yehuda that a derivative could be more chomer than the source. Zok to Gemara, no. It's not because it's a dover chomer. If a carrot, it's a kula. Hasam loya lima kedushte limitzvahs pejoina. The reason why the meiser that was already redeemed, you can't be paida, is because the concentration of its meiser content is too shvach to be able to transfer over to now a third object, and that's why it doesn't work. It's not because it's a chumrah, it's because it doesn't have enough essence. It doesn't have enough intensity to be able to transfer over. So that's not a good example of a derivative being more chomer than the source. So for Gemara, how about Tamura? The law is if you take a behemoth that's a Baal Mum and you say Arezu Oila, it doesn't become an Oila. It doesn't become an Oila because you cannot be Makdish a Baal Mum for a carbon. But what if I have a carbon already? I have an Oila. And I bring along another animal which is a Baal Mum. And I say Arezu, Tamura Zu, I want this animal with a Mum to be the Tamura of the Oila, it will be Chal. So again, the derivative of Kodesh is going to be more Chomer than Kodesh itself. By way Tamura, the Ilukachim loy chayli al Balmum Kavua. You couldn't be Mekadesh directly with Kedushas Aguf al Balmum Kavua, ve'ilu ihi, but a derivative of the Kachim, Chayla Tamura. Zakta Gemara, ve'ilu ihi Chayla Kama. And for the Gemara, there's a very big difference. That's not, once again, it's not because the derivative is more Chomer. It's because the derivative actually is much more Kodesh than the actual Chulun animal that you're starting to be Makdish. Because Tamura, Mikaya Kachim Kasya. But what am I doing by Tamura? I already have an existing Kedushas Aguf and I want to pass it on. That's something that I could do, even though the animal is a Balmum Kavua. But the Kachim and Mikaya Chulun Kasi, if you want to bashaf a new Kedusha that has not existed anywhere and place it on an animal, that's a much bigger uphill battle. That takes much more. That wouldn't be Chal on the Balmum. But if you already have Kachim, just to transfer it, that would be Chal. So therefore, once again, you have two attempts. You made two attempts to show that the derivative is more Chomer, and in each of these two attempts, we showed you that that's not Pshat. So how about Carbon Pesach? Hare Pesach, the hu eino iton smicha u'nesachem u'tenubas chazav v'shayim. On the Carbon Pesach, they don't do smicha. There are no nesachem brought to accompany it, and you don't do tenuba of the chazav v'shayim. V'ilu moiser today, but once the Erev Pesach passes and you have a leftover pesachim, it will need ton smicha u'nesachem u'tenubas chazav v'shayim. So you see that the derivative of the Pesach is more chomer than the Pesach itself.
What does that mean, the moister? What does that mean?
Moisture today means if you had a Carbon Pesach and you didn't need it for some reason, you didn't shecht it on their Pesach. So now you're after Pesach, you have this animal. So the animal has a din of a shlomim.
Oh.
And the shlomim needs smicha, nesachem, and tenubas chazav v'shoik. Zok the Gemara, shkoyach. Pesach b'shari moisture shon shlomim. The shlomim isn't a derivative of Pesach. A Pesach. I'm sorry?
It's a nishkam Pesach. It's a shlom.
It's a shlomim. You're getting the brisker schnit already.
Yeah.
A Pesach. Shlomu, v'loy Moshe Pesach mitri. Just hasten it Moshe Pesach. L'mich shevitofel. Tanaya eidin b'ashafenish. Moti, if you want to open up a brisk yeshiva, it's a good business. Look.
I haven't ate them in brisk. I have to play the part.
Gewaltig. Tell them in most cases to learn brisk. Come then by me.
Yeah.
Okay, gewaltig. So zog the Gemara. So we had three attempts to show that a derivative can be more chomer. That failed. So what are we blind with? That a derivative is never more chomer than the source. So therefore, since the derivative chatos, tzafon is ma'akiv, the source oila, tzafon will be ma'akiv. So that's one answer to how we know that a carbon oila, tzafon is ma'akiv. But the Boy Sema, we have another teretz. Amr kra ha'oila. The Torah says, "V'shachat is a chadas b'mkoim asher shachat ha'oila." You could have said b'mkoim asher shachat oila, but that was ha'oila. To tell you b'mkoim atahei, the oila must remain in its status the way it's supposed to be done, meaning that tzafon will be ma'akiv. Gewaltig. Zog the Gemara. We've covered Pesach. We've covered chatos. We covered oila. What about Asham? Asham we know long the boy tzafon. How do we know a carbon Asham needs tzafon? Zok Gemara, the Chesivin says in the pasuk, "B'mkoim asher yishchedu es ha'oila, yishchedu es ha'asham." In the place that you shech the oila, there you shall shech the asham, just like it says by chatas. Zok Gemara, Ashkechan shchita. This pasuk tells us that the shchita has to be b'tzafon. Kabbalah minolam. How do you think the Kabbalah has to be b'tzafon? Zok Gemara be'es doma yisrael. So let's have a quick look at the pasuk inside. It says b'mkoim asher yishchatu es ha'oila yishchatu es ha'asham. And immediately following that, the pasuk sticks in Ves Dama Yisrael. Mashma in the same place as we were in Tzafon. That's where the Zrika occurs. But we darshan Ves Dama Yisrael Kibul Dama Nami B'Tzafon. So let's look at the Shita Mukubetes. He makes the nusach a drop easier to read. So let's look at the Shita Mukubetes and Nois Dalit. Tevas Yisrael Lesa. Okay, so let's see what he says. Minalai, it says the S Domai. He takes out the word Yisrael. It says the S Domai, meaning the Dam also has the same halacha, as the Shchita. Now the Shita Mukabetis takes out the Domai as well. It says the S. Just from the word V'es, which is like connecting the Avodas Adam with the Shchita, that it also requires Tzafon. Kibul Damai Nami B'Tzafon, the Kibul Dam has to be B'Tzafon as well. So the Kabbalah has to be B'Tzafon. We learn it from V'es Damai. Frank the Gemara, Mikabel Atzmoi Minolam. How do you know that the person who is doing the Kabbalah has to be in the Tzafon? As we learned, by Shchita, just the animal has to be B'Tzafon, the Shchita has to occur B'Tzafon, but the person doing the Shchita can be B'Darin. But by the Kabbalah, we learned that the person being Mekabel the Dam also must be standing in the Tzafon. Shuminalan. Now tomorrow that's from Damai, V'es Damai. It says V'es Damai, because it said V'Damai Yisrael. It says V'es Damai to include the Zorek as well, must be standing in the Tzafon part of Dazar. Zok Gemara, very good. Ashkechon l'mitzvah. We have one place where the Torah tells us Tzafon by Osham, that's mitzvah. But we know when it comes to Kochim, in order for it to be Ma'akev, you have to say it twice. La'akev min olam. Zok Gemara, there's another pasuk by the Parsha of Osham where it says V'shachat es hakeves. Let me look in the Torah Ara Shalom so we get the whole pasuk. It says V'shachat es hakeves bimkoim asher yishchat es hachatos ves ha'olah bimkoim hakodesh ki kachatos ha'asham mula koyin kodesh kodeshim. So right now we're just focusing on V'shachat es hakeves bimkoim asher yishchat es hachatos ves ha'olah. It's repeated a second time to tell us that it's ma'akev. But the Gemara is going to dissect this pasuk because look what's going on over here. V'shachat es hakeves bimkoim asher yishchat es hachatos ves ha'olah. Why do you need both? Either chatos or olah will give us the information we need of Tzafon. Why is the pasuk doubling down? And then ki kachatos ha'asham ul l'koyin. The asham is like the chatos, like a nachabal iber gechasid. Like how many times do we need to teach us the same thing? So the Gemara is going to dash in this very, very beautifully. So zok the Gemara, ashchan the mitzvah la'akev min olam. The Gemara krachrina seir v'shachat as a keves. I always tell my wife always asks me, I don't understand. Why do I always have to ask you to do something twice? Why can't you just do it after the first time I ask? I tell my wife, because I'm kachim. And kachim, it's not ma'akev until it's twice. It didn't work. Don't try that at home. Are you telling me the reason why the pasuk repeats Tzafon by Osham is to tell us that it's ma'akev? We need it for something much more important. Now we're learning now the Perek of Bezim Mekayman, but right at the end of the Perek of Bezim Mekayman in Karbonis, we say the Brayso Rabbi Shmuel. And one of the Devar that the Torah is the Dreshes by is Davar Shayi Bachlal, the Yotza Lidin B'Davar Achadash, That's one of the things. We always read them, I don't know what it's talking about, so when we have a live example, it's Gishmak. So Davar Shaya Bechlal. The Asham Etzaira was a regular Asham. So we would assume it has all of the halachas of a regular Asham. But then the Torah says, no. By Asham, there's something different. The dam you also put on the Boyin Yodai Hayimanis, Boyin Raglai Hayimanis, and Tanuch Ozna Hayimanis. So the Asham Mitzayra was Yotzim in a klal. So Davar Shahaya Bechlal, it was in the klal of Asham. And then the Yotza, then the Torah took the Asham Mitzayra out of the klal of regular Ashamais, Lidain B'Davar Achadish, to teach us Achidish to Gezach, a new type of Matnanas Dam that doesn't exist anywhere else. So once the Torah does that, then Asham Mitzvah is no longer treated like a regular Asham. It's its own entity, and you cannot learn any halachas from a regular Asham to the Asham Mitzvah. So the question is, so how do we know that you need Zrika on the Mizbeach by the Asham? How do you know you even need Taf on the Chatchila? How do you know you need to be Makter Murim? You don't know any halachas. Because Iyata Rashoy Lachsir Lecholoi, Achiach Sirana Kasav Lecholoi Beferish. Keta, the Gemara gives the example. It says the Shachat is a kevis b'mkoy masher yishchat es a chatos v'es ha'oilo b'mkoy ma'kodesh hi kachatas ha'oshamu. She'ein Talmud loymar kachatas ha'osham. Kachatas ha'osham is like very redundant in the pasuk. It's repetitive. Why did the Torah say that? Ma Talmud loymar kachatas ha'osham. The teretz is because of this problem that we had. The fisher yotza asham mitzayra lidoy b'davar achadesh b'boyin yadu boyin regel v'oizin yamanis. The Torah gave Asham Mechudishtik halachas. That doesn't exist anywhere else, which tells us that it should no longer follow any of the generic terms of an Asham. So I would think it's a whole new carbon, and therefore Yochel Lo Yeheton Matan Domim. You would have thought that you don't make Zrika on the Mizbeach at all with the dam of the Asham Mitzayra, ve'emurin, and you don't have to be Makter Emurin like a Mizbeach because it doesn't repeat those halachas by the Asham Mitzvah. Zakta Gemara, that's why it says Talmud Loimer Kachatas Ha'ashamu. The Torah says treat the Asham like a chat. This Asham Mitzvah treated like a chatas. Ma chatas to unamat and domim beimur and lagabim mizbeach. Just like a chatas needs these things. Av Asham Mitzvah ton mat and domim beimur and lagabim mizbeach. So kum techa is this secondary pasuk of Yishachar is Hakesh b'mkoyma sheYishachar is Hachadas v'zoyla is very not extra. So if it's very not extra, it just tells you that it should go back into the klal of Hashamais. Well, if that's the case, how do we know that Safain is ma'akiv even b'di'evet? Zok to Gemara, we have to have a little bit of a discussion. What does it mean? Davar shahay b'chlal v'yotzim in achlal iyat harashay lachsir lechlolay at sheyachsirun yakazav lechlol b'ferish. Now the Pashup shot means is that once you say Asham is different, Asham Mitzayr is different than all other Ashamais, so whatever applies to all other Ashamais does not necessarily apply to this Asham. But what about the other way around? What about what applies by this Asham? Can you apply that back to regular Ashamais? The Gemara wants to probe, maybe yes. So therefore, Zog to Gemara, Im kain nichtoi v'hai v'lo nichtoi v'hai. Why did the Torah B'chlal tell us all of the halachas of Asham in the generic parsha of Asham? The Torah should have taught us all of the halachas of Asham by the Asham Mitzvah dafke, and we would have still been able to teach from Asham Mitzvah to all Ashamais the regular avodas, Tzafain, the Emurin, not the special thing of Boyan, but the regular halachas, maybe we could still teach back to regular Hashem. So therefore, the Torah should have only told us the halachas of Tzafain by the Hashem Mitzvah, but not by the regular Hashemais, and I would have known it by the regular Hashemais. But the fact is, the Torah said it in both places. Sai by the Hashem Mitzvah, sai by the regular Hashemais. That redundancy tells us that it's mat. Zok to Gemara, that only works if you allow a limud one way. That tells me that we can't learn Hashem Mitzvah from other Hashemais. However, maybe other Hashemais we could learn from Hashem Mitzvah. Turning on to Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis. Maybe you would very easily be able to teach from Hashem Mitzvah back to regular Hashem. Shapir. That would work. So now you say you have a redundancy because it could have just said it by Hashem Mitzvah. And we would have known it by regular Hashem. And since the Torah says it in both places, it's a right that there's a redundancy and it's makir. If you hold Davar Shiyotzim in a Klal Lamed for a Davar Chadosh, there's a complete severance, and you can't learn either way. So weiter, I need both psukim halugufei yistra, and I don't have anything extra to teach me. I don't have anything extra to teach me that it's ma'akif. So I want to pause here for a second because I was scratching my head. In the Gemara's tzad that you can learn one way, not the other way. I don't understand. So you cannot, once the Torah gives a chiddush by Mitzayra, you can no longer apply everything by a regular Asham to Mitzayra. But the Gemara is suggesting maybe I could apply what I learned by Mitzayra back to regular Hashamis. So then the question is, if I'm applying what I learned by regular Asham to Hashamis, like I'll be tzafin, like I'll be Aktor Seimurin, like I'll be spritzing the blood on the Mizbeach, well, maybe I should also learn Bain Yodei by Raglai. Like, where do you draw the line? Mimadashach. If you hold, you can't teach either way. Okay, it's a complete severance. But if you say you can learn from the Hasham and Torah back to the regular Asham, so how can you pick and choose what you're going to learn and what you're not going to learn? The Gemara is suggesting you learn all the halachas of a regular Asham, including Tzafin, just not Bain Yad. Why? That's what
all those other things are diamond by other kabbalas. Bain Yoda is a very unique thing. That's a prat. That's not a klal.
You became a full-blown brisker. So that's what Rashi says. I believe what Rashi is exactly what you're saying. So let's look at the top Rashi. The thing that's not like off the chart, that's so unique that doesn't apply to anything else, that you would be able to learn, which is I think what you're saying. Going Shchitas Tzafon, you have Eksiva Bey, if it would have said it by the Hasham Mitzayra, V'lo have Eksiva B'shar Shammais, Garbulei Shar Shammais from there. You'd be able to learn other Shammais from Hasham Mitzayra. The Lachidishu. These halachas, like Moti said, are not a chiddush. You find them in all karbanos. It's a yosem in a klal. But l'maisa v'lamed al dover shenem b'chal. You will be able to learn it. V'heichi yotze lidim dover achodesh. What is that dover achodesh that you wouldn't transmit back to regular shama? Goymat and domim shebezel mizbech ubezeh shina v'armel l'bahinis. So the really unique things that wouldn't go back, but the regular things would go back. So therefore, the Gemara held us for Akasha, but the problem is, if you hold, you can learn either way. So back to square one. How do I have an extra halacha of tzafon to teach us about Asham and Tzmakiv? Zok Gemara, you know what the answer is? Kivan da hadri hadri. Yeah, till the Torah said kachatas Asham, I agree with you. But now that it says kachatas Asham, the Torah is saying Asham went squarely back into the parsha of regular Ashamais, and therefore, once the Torah put Asham squarely back into the parsha of regular Hashamis, the Torah could have only written all the halachas of an Asham by Hasham Mitzayra, and you would have been able to teach it back to regular Asham. We didn't. The Torah didn't do that. The Torah said, "Shai by regular Asham, Shai by Hasham Mitzayra." That's redundancy, and therefore it's mak. Gavaltik. Zok to Gemara, you're not out of the wood yet, because you're assuming once the Torah says Kachadash Asham, it's making the Asham exactly like every other Asham. Maybe it's only making this Asham like every other Asham, like a certain halachas. As Marzuka said, Amalei Marzuka Raider Amari Ravina, Emakia Hadre Kra is only like a Matan Damim Veimurin, the boy Kuna. Maybe Davka Matan Damim and Emurim, you have to spritz on the Mizbeach, you have to be Makrev the Emurim on the Mizbeach. Maybe that's what we're saying. The Asham Mitzayra goes back to join the regular Hashamis. Like that halacha. Why punkt l'gabi that halacha? Because they require a kohen. Avol shchita, the lebayikuna, shchita that doesn't need a kohen, maybe let me buy something. Maybe you don't have a redundancy. You can't learn back and forth. So the obvious question is, what does being a kohen, what does that have to do with whether or not you're going to import it back and forth? So Rashi says something very, very important. Rashi says the boy kahuna. So Rashi says, when the Torah put Hasham Mitzayra back into the parsha of Hashamis, then what does the Torah say? Kachatas ha'asham hu lakoyin. It sticks in the word hu lakoyin. So maybe when the Torah is putting the asham back into the parsha of Hashamis, maybe that's dafka le'inyan avodah shebekoyin, because it says lakoyin. So maybe the Torah is only putting the asham back, the Hasham Mitzayra back into the klal of all the Hashamis, only the gabi avodas that need a koyin, but not shchita. So once again, how do you know? Where do you see a redundancy that the shchita has to be b'tzafon?
Well, what about also the Indian the halacha of bayin?
Of what?
Of putting it on your finger, or just the fact that it's
the gabi bayin, as you said, that never gets sent back to the mainstream asham.
It says lagabe matan domim. It's just talking about the tzafin.
Matan domim means on the mizbeach.
But Mitzayra is not on the mizbeach.
Mitzvah is both. Remember, we learned that in the Mitzvah there's two kohanim who make Kabbalah Saddam. One with a keli, that was right on the first daf of one with a keli, and he's going to go to the mizbeach with it, and one with his hand, and he's going to put it on the ears. Remember that? I think we had that like on the first.
Yeah, of course.
There's two. There's a Dr. Gemara weiter. Dr. Gemara weiter. So Dr. Gemara im kain, if that was the case, that we're only talking about avoidance related to kahuna, you know what the pasuk should have said? Name a krok kikachatasu. It could have just said kikachatasu, and I would have known it's like a chatas, like a kahuna tegazachen. But the Torah was very redundant, very repetitive. My kachatas ha'asham. It's sticking to the word ha'asham again to tell you teshar ashamois yiyah. It's exactly like every other asham for all of its halachas, including tzafon. So therefore, tzafon is repeated twice. Sai by regular shamois, sai by Hashem Torah. That's redundancy. That's market. Now we have a fascinating sugya. There are so many rules in Kachim, like you think, where do these rules come from? So we have a rule, that's one rule we have, which makes it easy to learn things. Then we have some rules that make it hard to learn things. Right? We learn Dover Halomid the Hekesh. You cannot teach with a Hekesh. So if a sugya imports a halacha through a Hekesh, you cannot export that same Shchiddish through a Hekesh. So in some ways, by Kachim, it's hard to learn. In some ways, by Kachim, it's easier to learn. Now, where do you know this from? Who makes up these rules? So where do we know this concept that something that you learned with a Hekesh cannot be exported with a Hekesh? That's what the Gemara is going to discuss today. The Gemara is going to show us two sources in the Torah, where the Torah is virtually telling us that something that you learned with a Hekesh, you may not export with a Hekesh. So, fact Gemara as follows: Lamali lakshay lachatas, lamali lakshay la'ila. It's very modern in the pasuk by Asham. The pasuk said you should check it b'mkoy mashe yishaker es lachatas, b'mkoy mashe yishaker es la'ila. That's very redundant. Zok to Gemara, Amar Avina, I'll tell you why the Torah was makish to both chatas and oila. Because akashay lechatas, v'loy akashay la'oila, if the Torah only made a hekesh to chatas and would not have mentioned oila, havamina, I would have told myself, chatas is not the source. Chatas is a derivative of oila. Chatas mehechen lamda me'oila. Which means the Torah is telling me, even though chatas only learned its halacha from oila that you need tzafay, meaning it's a davar alamid behekesh, chayzer u'malamid behekesh. The Torah is using chatas, which is a davar alamid behekesh, to teach Osha. So you see clearly not like our rule. So that's why the Torah had to say oila, so that you should know that a davar alamid behekesh is not chayzer u'malamid behekesh. So Amalei Marzuta Bereder of Mori Ravina, okay. So v'nikshe la'oila v'lo nikshe l'chatas. So the Torah should have just said the Asham Yishach Asham b'mkoy ma yishach to oila. Why does thing chatas as well? Zok to Gemara. I'm gonna read in the Shinu Nischois at the side because it makes it geschmacker. Amalei iakshay la'oila v'lo yakshay l'chatas. If the Torah only made a hekesh to oila and not the chatas, havamina, you know what I would have said? Davar halomid behekesh chayzer u'malamid behekesh. I would have said that something that you learn with Hekesh, you could teach with Hekesh. If that's the case, v'chitema imkein nikshe akushi lachatos. Why did the Torah pick oila to be the Hekesh to Asham? The Torah could have picked chatos to be the Hekesh to Asham. If in fact you hold davar lamed behekesh chayzer malamed behekesh. So you might want to say, so that's a dikuch minei. The fact that the Torah chose oila over chatos, that in and of itself proves that davar lamed behekesh you cannot teach with Hekesh. That's why the Torah chose oila, not chatos. But that's not a riot. Because even if you would have been able to use chatos, there's still a logical reason for the Torah to use oila. Because nichalei the makish leila ikir v'lo nakish leila tachel. If you have a choice of learning asham from the source oila or from the chatos, which is the derivative, even if both Hekeshim would technically be acceptable, your preference would still be to learn it directly from the source. So the Torah actually wrote both chatas and oila. L'hagi actually l'chatas v'akshel oila, because the Torah was sending us a message to teach us a rule that we need to apply b'chol Torah kula l'gabe kachim l'meimar davar lamed behekesh she'enoi Einoi Chayzer Umlamed Hekesh. The Valta Torah was Makish Osham both the Chatas and the Oilot to tell us the reason why I have to put Oilot even though Chatas is there because Chatas wouldn't work. So since there's this redundancy, the Torah is sending us a message that anything that you learn with the Hekesh, you cannot teach with the Hekesh. So that's one beautiful makar. We run into this klal all the time. Dover Lamed Hekesh, you can't teach with Hekesh by kachim. How do we know? We know it from our sugya here of Asham, where we know that Asham is shechted b'tzachim. Rava Amar, Rava said, I actually have another makar. Rava Amar, and I'm going back into the Shinin Yischois, Dover Halamed Behekesh, Einei Chayzer Malamed Behekesh, Mehacha. We learned it from another pasuk. Dichsiv, again a pasuk that we're very familiar with. Now, let's scratch our memories back to the series of Chatois. The Torah introduces the parasha of Chatois with a Chatos Par Koyin HaMashiach. And in the parasha of Chatos Par Koyin HaMashiach, the Torah lists off every last detail of what has to be done with the skarbin, the Zrika, the Haktaras Hemurim, the Shiraim, everything. And then the Torah adds another redundant comment by the Par Koyin HaMashiach. Kasher Yuram Mishar Zevach HaShlamim. All of these Emurim need to be placed on the Mizbeach, just like by the Shlamim. Why do I need to know the Tushtel to Shlamim? It's very clearly detailed in the parasha of Par Koyin Mashiach. Now let's stop a second before we move on weiter. What's the next parasha right there after Par Koyin Mashiach? Was Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur. And if you remember, we learned a couple of days ago that by Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur, it basically lists off all the details that the Par Koyin Mashiach lists off, except for one detail, except for the akrava of the Yeseres HaKavod and the Shtei HaKlayis. That's the only detail missing by Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur. But we also have, it says by the Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur, Kasher Asa Kein Tase. Whatever you did by the Par Koyin Mashiach, you should repeat by the Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur. The Gemara asked, why does it have to say that if we already listed off by the Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur everything? So, because of the Hekesh, we know Yeseres HaKavod and Shtei HaKlayis. It doesn't say Yeseres HaKavod and Shtei HaKlayis by Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur. So maybe from the we also kasher also due to the Par Helam Dover, like you did to the Par Koyin Mashiach, even though it lists off every detail by Par Helam Dover, I don't need to learn anything from Par Koyin Mashiach. The one thing that I need to learn is Yeseres HaKavod and Shtei HaKlayis. Okay, then the Gemara says, how do I know that that sugya was about knowing that everything is ma'akiv down to the last matnas dam? That's what we learned from each other there. The Gemara said, you know what else is included in this list? The seirei avodos kechavim. If they bring a seir for avodos kechavim, it also has all these halachas. How do we know it? Because there's a hekesh from Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur to the seirei avodos kechavim. So let's think about it. The Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur only knows Yeseres HaKavod and Shtei HaKlayis. It only knows it Par Koyin Mashiach. Yet with the hekesh, it's exporting it to the seirei avodos kechavim. That's our problem here. So let's have a look. Zok the Gemara. It says an extra phrase in the parasha of Par Koyin Mashiach. Kasher Yura Mishar Zevach HaShlamim L'ma Hilchasa. Ili Yeseres HaKavod U'Shtei HaKlayis. If it's to teach us that by the Par Koyin Mashiach, you have to be makter on the Mizbeach, the Yeseres HaKavod U'Shtei HaKlayis, it's black and white in the pasuk, it's listed there. We don't need any information imported from Shlamim. Elamai, it's Mishum, Elamishum, the boy Agmure Yeseres HaKavod U'Shtei HaKlayis with Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur. Problem is, we want to use Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur as a source to transmit through a hekesh to l'sirei avodos kechavim. But the problem is, bigufei loiksiv. So I'm going to read the Shir Nitzchos. Upar Helam Dover Shel Tzibur bigufei loiksiv. It doesn't say Yeseres HaKavod and Shtei HaKlayis by Par Helam Dover. So how could it export that information with a hekesh? How do we know it by the Par Helam Dover? Only from a hekesh. So that is the problem that we have. So therefore, the boy Agmur Yeseres HaKavod U'Shtei HaKlayis mi Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur l'sirei avodos kechavim ubigufei loiksiv. It doesn't say it. What is the whole makar to Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibur? Only Par Koyin Mashiach U'Degamar. That's a hekesh and a hekesh. Kasher Yuram. That's why it says Kasher Yuram by Par Kohen Mashiach. I definitely don't need Kasher Yuram by the Parsha Par Kohen Mashiach. So let's make believe the Par Kohen Mashiach will make believe it says Kasher Yuram by the Par Kohen Tibor, and that'll make it the Nahava command, the cost of the Gufay. We'll be able to use that to make believe, like it says Mefurish, by the Par Helam Doshal Tibor, the Halacha of Aktaris Yeseris Hakaveh and Stei Akloyos, and therefore V'lo Nahava Davar Halomay Behekesh Chayzer Umelamed Behekesh. You see this convoluted way? The Torah sticks in an extra word by Par Mashiach, which is not relevant there. So let's make believe it said those words by Par Helam Doshal Tibor, and since it says extra word by Par Helam Doshal Tibor, that'll make it as if what Par Helam Doshal from Mashiach, it's as if it was written Minei Obey in the Parsha Par Helam Doshal Tibor. Now that we can consider it like it's written Minei Obey in the Parsha Par Helam Doshal Tibor, now we can export it to Sirah who's come with a Hekesh. Amalei Papa, there's a much simpler way of doing this. Amalei Papa L'Rava v'lichtavei begufei v'lenakish. You know what the Torah could have said? Instead of hacking a China and going back and forth, the Torah should have just said Mufurish in the Parsha of Par Helam Doshal Tibor. Yosher Sakov instead of I wouldn't have need Kasher Yuram. All it had to do with the Torah was write Mefurish in the Parsha of Par Helam Davar. Yosher Sakov instead of the Torah didn't have to write it by Par Kohen Mashiach. You could have learned it with the Hekesh. The Torah didn't need to write it by Shreva to come. You could have learned it with the Hekesh. So why do such a convoluted thing? Put it by Par Helam Davar and learn it to put it by Par Kohen Mashiach. The Torah put this halacha of Yosher Sakov by Par Kohen Mashiach. And with Hekesh, it exports it to Par Helam Davar. But it's still not written the version of Dover, so put another pasuk of Kasher Yuram by Par Kohen Mashiach to make believe as if it's written before in Par Kohen Mashiach. So now I can export it to Syria to come. That's a really convoluted way of doing things. It would be so much simpler just to have written the halacha of Yosher Sakaved in the Parsha of Par Helam Dover, and everything would be so much more simple. So why did the Torah do such a verdraita way of doing it? Lahachi yitztrich Kasher Yuram the Nahavi command the Ksiv Gufay. So Amalei Pablo Rabba, what do you have to do in such a complicated situation? Just say the halacha by Par Helam Davar, which would be much simpler. Zok Gemara, the Torah was trying to send us a message. If we didn't learn Par Helam Davar from a Hekesh, it would have said Minei Obey in the Parsha Par Helam Davar, the halacha of Yesher Sakaved and Shtei Akloyos. Havamina, I would have never known this rule. I would have said that Davar Alomid Behekesh, Chazum Alamid Behekesh. And if you're going to ask me, so why doesn't it mention it Davka by Par Helam Davar and not by Par Kohen Mashiach? No. It's so much simpler and more logical to just write in the Parsha Par Helam Davar about the Yosher Sakaved and the Shtei Akloyos. And it would make everything simple. But not because a Dover Halamid Behekesh you can't export with Hekesh, just because it's so much simpler and more practical. Since the Torah did this in such a twisted way, it didn't mention it by Par Helam Dover. It forced Par Helam Dover only to know it through a Hekesh, and it sticks in the Kasher Yuram to take care of the Legufei problem. That teaches us that it must be that in a regular case, in a regular case, what you learn with a Hekesh, what you import with a Hekesh, you cannot export with a Hekesh. So we have two Makaris. So again, I'm always amazed by the rules of Kachim, because on the one hand we're very strict. But on the other hand, I'll put something by Par Kohen Mashiach, an extra word, and I'll allude to Shlomim, and we're going to make believe that this belongs by Par Helam Davar, and this like I would think that's so much more far-fetched than Davar Halamid Behekesh, Chayzim Lamed Behekesh. But at the end of the day, there's no YouTube video on how to darshan psukim. Chazal tell us that this very far-fetched limud is how you darshan kachim, and something that seems to be pretty well-founded. Davar Lamed Behekesh, we can't ask questions. But I just think it's fascinating because the Torah does such a deny with many Gufos to make this work. But a davar alam hekesh, that's out. Okay, gewaltig. Zogt het gemor weiter. Hekesh kal v'chaymer. So we discussed the davar alam hekesh. You cannot teach with the hekesh. Gemor now discuss two shabbos. Something that you learn with the hekesh, can you export it with Gzera Shava? A, and B is, can you export it with a kal v'chaymer? So kal v'chaymer is going to be tomorrow, but today we're going to discuss if something was imported through a hekesh, can you export it through a Gzera Shava? Zogt the Gemara. Davar alam hekesh ein chayzer umelamed hekesh. That we know. How do we know it? Imi de Rava, imi de Ravina. Rava holds we learn it from the Kasher Yuram. Ravina learns it from the Asham that's compared to Achatas and the Noida. What about Davar Alamed Behekesh? Mao Shiyomad B'Gzera Shach. Dr. Martoshma, I'm going to show you an example of just such a thing. Rab Notzin ben Avtolmus Omer, Minayin leprichas bibegodim shitayra. Now we know there's a halacha that if you have a nega on your body and it spreads and it covers your entire body, you're tahor. How do we know that halacha also applies to a nega on a beged? That if it spreads to the entire beged, it becomes tahor. Zok Gemara, I know it from a gzeira shava, from karachas. Nemer karachas v'gabachas b'begodim. The Torah uses the term karachas and gabachas when it talks about nigei begodim. It also uses a karachas and gabachas when it's talking about nigei harosh v'zaken. V'nemer karachas v'gabachas ba'odom. And therefore we say, mal lahalon harach v'kulei tar, just like a nega in a person, if it spreads across the whole body is tar. Afghan, so too by the karachas and gabachas of a beged, harach v'kulei tar. The problem is, how do you know that a nega b'karachas u'gabachas of a person, how do you know that if it spreads to his whole body, that he's tar? Where do you know that from? What is the source? The source is a hekesh. Meiroshai would be karachas v'gabachas, but raglov is regular basar. The Torah only talks about the nega that spreads to the whole body is tar by raglov, by a nega that's on the basar. It doesn't talk about it by a nega that's on the head, which is what the karachas and the gabachas is. So the only way I know that the karachas and the bachas also has this tahira is because of a hekesh. The ishkis roy shel regel. And now I'm going to change the gears a little bit based on the shita mukvetzes. Mal lahalon harach b'kulei tahar, avkan harach b'kulei tahar. So now you have a perfect example of something that was learned through a hekesh. Karachas v'gabachas of an adam was learned from a hekesh of basar adam, and it's exported through a gzera shava to karachas and gabachas by a beged. Rabbi Yochanan, what's your raya? We're talking about kachim. You're bringing your raya that by non-kachim you could pass on through a gzera shava what you learn with the hekesh. That's not being disputed. Our discussion is by kachim. Rabbi Yochanan, you could even learn a hekesh from a hekesh. It's only kachim that are different. And I'll prove to you that that's the case. The imkain lo yoymar tzafayna ba'asham. We had a whole sugya. How do you know that by asham needs tzafayna? And we said because the Torah says it didn't need to do all that. The taste of gzera shava. You have a very simple gzera shava of all karbonis that are kachim. The kachim. It says the word kachim by chatois. It says the word kachim by ashamois. You have a gzera shava, but you don't say that. What do you see from here? Now, by kachim, lav lemember the davar alamed behekesh ein chayzer umlamed b'gzera shava. So your raya from the goyim is not a raya because we know that kachim is a different set of rules. Zakamar lav davka. Maybe the reason why you couldn't use the gzera shava of kachim to kachim is mishum dikal mifrach. Maybe it's not a gzera shava mufna. And if it's not a gzera shava mufna, if the words kachim are not extra words in either parsha, then you can ask a kasha on the gzera shava, and you can ask, I can't learn from chatas to asham because malachatas shekain mechaperes al chayvik rizas. Zok Gemara, you're mistaken. It's a gzera shava mufna nishnei todin kachi miseriksiv. So you have a bona fide airtight Xereshava, yet we don't rely on it. So doesn't that prove to you that something that you learned through a Hekesh, you cannot export through a Xereshava by Kochim? So tomorrow we'll learn the next sugya of Dover Alamid Mehekesh, Chayzer Umelamed Bekal V'chayim. Okay, Bez Hashem, I plan to be there in person tomorrow. I'm actually hoping to leave in the next 10 minutes. They want you to have an awesomely wonderful day. Thank you very much. All the best.
Simchas.
Shkoyach. So.